Charleston was sleeping. It was one of those quiet southern nights where the city felt like it was holding its breath. The streetlights cast long, soft shadows over cracked sidewalks. A humid breeze carried the faint scent of salt water from the harbor. An occasional chirp of a late-night bird echoed through the stillness. Everything was calm. Caleb Mercer had always appreciated nights like this. They reminded him of balance, of a world that, for a few hours, seemed to forget its chaos. He had just left a late dinner with colleagues from the federal courthouse. Italian food. A bottle of red split between 3 seasoned prosecutors. Laughter over shared war stories, some wins, some losses. It was a kind of night where you loosen your tie, toss your jack in the back seat, and drive with one hand on the wheel. Window slightly cracked, music low. And that's exactly what Caleb was doing. He wasn't thinking about work, or the stack of case files waiting for him on his desk. He certainly wasn't thinking about race, power, or the weight of being a black man in a system that often saw his skin before his credentials. He was just going home. Then the lights appeared, red and blue, flashing, relentless. He saw them dance in his rear-view mirror, turning the darkness behind him into a neon alarm bell. Caleb's stomach sank, not with fear, but with familiarity. He took a deep breath, flicked on his turn signal, and pulled smoothly to the curb. He turned down the music, put both hands on the steering wheel, waited. No sudden movements. No reaching. No assumptions. He had taught himself this ritual over years of existing in America with both a badge and brown skin. It didn't matter that he was a federal prosecutor. Not out here. Not at night. Not when the flashing lights belonged to men who didn't know him, but thought they did. He watched in his side mirror as 2 figures stepped out of a patrol car. Both white, both young, both walking like they owned the road. The one approaching on the driver's side was broad-shouldered, clean-cut, and wore the kind of posture that said he didn't tolerate questions. Officer Landon Greaves. The second, leaner, quicker in his stride, rounded the passenger's side with quiet calculation. Officer Tyler Rowe. Caleb rolled down his window halfway, calm but alert. Evening, officers. Greaves didn't return the courtesy. License and registration. His voice was clipped. No warmth. No explanation. Caleb handed over the documents, his movements slow and deliberate. May I ask why I was stopped? There was a pause. Greaves exchanged a glance with Rowe. Just a flick of the eyes, but Caleb caught it. He had seen that look before. In court, in depositions, in interrogation rooms. It was the look of men sinking their story. Your taillight's out, Greaves finally said. Caleb didn't react immediately. He simply blinked once, then glanced at his rear-view mirror. The taillights reflected red, strong, steady. The car had passed inspection last week. He knew they worked. That's strange, she said softly. They were just checked. Greaves didn't budge. Rowe, still silent, rested one hand near his holster. Caleb's jaw tensed slightly. He wasn't scared, but he was awake now. Fully present in a way only certain moments demand. He knew this wasn't about a taillight. It was about presence, authority, control. It was about the story these 2 officers had already written and were now eager to play out. I'm just trying to understand, Caleb continued, still composed. Is there another reason for the stop? Greaves leaned in slightly. Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. There it was, the pivot. The moment the stop turned from inconvenience to escalation. Caleb's mind ran through the law like muscle memory. He didn't have to exit the vehicle unless there was probable cause or reasonable suspicion of a crime. A broken taillight, especially a fictional one, was not that. With respect, he said carefully, unless you can tell me why, I prefer to remain inside my car. Rowe smirked on the passenger side. It was the kind of smirk that came from knowing how this usually ends. Greaves narrowed his eyes. Because we said so. Caleb took a breath. He could feel the shift now. The thin line between dignity and danger stretching taut. He had defended the Constitution in courtrooms across the state, had watched juries deliberate on evidence and ethics. But none of that mattered here. Not on this street. Not tonight. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. And in that moment, he realized something chilling. They didn't see a federal prosecutor. They didn't see years of education, service, or legal precision. They saw a black man sitting in a car at midnight, and they had already decided what that meant. The silence after Caleb's refusal felt heavier than any shout. Greaves didn't like it. Not the tone, not the restraint, certainly not the defiance wrapped in legality. He took a small step back, just enough to adjust his posture. Step out of the vehicle. Now! His voice was sharper this time, more command than request. Caleb's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Not in fear, in calculation. Every second felt like a chess move. He wasn't just sitting in a car anymore. He was sitting in a narrative already written without him. And now, every word, every blink, every breath he took was being weaponized. "I'd like to comply," Caleb said, calmly but firmly. "But I'm within my legal rights to remain in the vehicle unless you can provide a valid cause. The alleged taillight issue doesn't meet that standard." Greaves' jaw tightened. Rowe, standing by the passenger window, chuckled under his breath. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was mockery, contempt, the kind of sound that dared you to think the law was yours to claim. "You think you're clever, huh?" Rowe muttered, finally speaking. Caleb looked over. Their eyes met. "I think I know my rights." A pause. Then everything unraveled. Greaves reached forward, yanked the driver's side door open with a force that rattled the hinges. Caleb barely had time to turn his head before a rough hand clamped onto his wrist. "Out of the car." Greaves barked. Caleb's seatbelt resisted, snapping tight across his chest as Greaves pulled him forward. The strap bit into his shoulder, anchoring him as his body twisted awkwardly. "What the hell are you doing?" Caleb snapped. Greaves didn't answer. His grip just tightened. From the other side, Rowe moved fast. In a matter of seconds, both of Caleb's arms were seized. The cold bite of metal cuffs snapped around his wrists with practiced indifference. "You're resisting," Greaves growled. Caleb was stunned, not by the physical act, but by the sheer ease of it. There was no struggle, no threat, just the illusion of danger. Crafted by the officers, sold by the badge, and now enforced by brute force. He was pressed against the hood of his own car. The metal was cool against his cheek. His heart wasn't pounding from fear. It was rage. Deep, controlled, dangerous rage. Because this wasn't new. This was a script that had played out across towns, cities, states, for decades. A black man, pulled over without cause, challenged a lie with truth, then punished for the audacity. He could already see the paperwork forming in their minds. The narrative, the report, subject was uncooperative, displayed erratic behavior, feared for our safety. He had written motions dissecting these exact kinds of lies. He had cross-examined officers who twisted facts until they snapped. But now here he was, living it. "What exactly are you charging me with?" he asked, voice low but unbroken. Rowe was already walking back to the patrol car, radio in hand. Greaves muttered, "Obstruction, resisting, disorderly conduct. All because I asked why you stopped me?" Greaves didn't respond. Caleb smiled bitterly. He wasn't surprised. He was angry because this wasn't about him. Not really. It was about the thousands of other men like him who never made it past the hood of their car, who didn't carry a badge, who couldn't quote constitutional code, who didn't get the benefit of calm and polite. And for those men, the story usually ended right here, in cuffs, in silence. But not tonight. Greaves led Caleb toward the squad car. Cameras on the dashboard blinked softly, most likely off. Caleb didn't bother to ask. He already knew the answer. As the door closed behind him, and the cruiser pulled away, the city of Charleston still slept. The harbor wind still whispered. And somewhere deep inside Caleb Mercer, a decision had already been made. They thought they arrested another black man who'd stay quiet. They were wrong. The holding cell was cold, not physically, but psychologically. The walls were sterile, off-white, and indifferent. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering just enough to agitate the nerves. Caleb Mercer sat on a plastic bench, hands still cupped behind his back, posture straight, refused to let them see even a hint of defeat. He had been here before. Not in this exact room, but in others like it, on the other side of the glass, asking questions, not answering them. But tonight, he was the one in the cage. And all because he had asked one. Why am I being asked to step out my car? That was it. That was the question that turned a traffic stop into an arrest. That was the spark that set off Greaves and Rowe. Two officers who saw a black man and heard a tone they didn't like. Not loud, not rude, just assertive, just informed, just enough to threaten the illusion of their control. He thought back to the moment Greaves leaned in, posture stiff, voice clipped. Caleb hadn't yelled, hadn't cursed. He didn't have to. All he did was demand reason. And in a world built on fragile egos behind bulletproof vests, that was more than enough. The cell door buzzed open. Footsteps. Sharp, deliberate. A uniformed officer stepped in with a clipboard, flanked by a plainclothes sergeant. Older, grayer. Clearly in charge. The sergeant looked Caleb up and down, frowning as if trying to assess whether this man in slacks and cufflinks fit, the arrest paperwork sitting in his hands. "Mr. Mercer," the sergeant said. Caleb didn't respond. He didn't nod. He didn't flinch. The sergeant continued anyway. "You're being processed for obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct." Caleb's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Is that what they went with?" The sergeant paused, caught off guard by the calm sarcasm. "I'm not here to argue," he said. "You'll have your chance in court." Caleb tilted his head. "Will I? Or will this go the way it usually does? Officers write a narrative. The DA rubber stamps it, and a black man gets buried under charges he never deserved." The officer with the clipboard shifted uncomfortably. The sergeant cleared his throat. "You're entitled to legal counsel. One's being arranged." "I'll represent myself," Caleb replied instantly. That made the sergeant pause again. "You're an attorney?" "Assistant United States Attorney. Southern District." Silence. Real, deep silence. The kind that breaks through even the thickest badge-backed arrogance. The sergeant didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared, and Caleb stared right back. "Yeah," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the tension. "That's the part they didn't bother to ask." The officer with the clipboard took a step back. The sergeant blinked hard and looked down at the form in his hand, as if it had just become radioactive. "Why didn't you say something?" The sergeant asked, suddenly defensive. "I was waiting for someone to care." There was no anger in his voice, just disappointment, and something colder, something sharper. Because Caleb had seen this before, had prosecuted cases just like this. He had watched footage of innocent men being brutalized, their voices ignored because the system was too comfortable with silence. But this time, he wasn't a viewer. He was the exhibit. The sergeant stepped out to make a phone call. Caleb could hear fragments through the wall. Didn't know who he was. What do you want to do with him? No, there's no body cam footage. He sat there, every word landing like confirmation, not just of their negligence, but of how fragile their power really was. It didn't matter that they were wrong. It mattered that they thought they were untouchable. And Caleb had just reminded them they weren't. When the door opened again, the energy had changed. His cuffs were removed. A different officer, young, nervous, handed him back his wallet and phone without a word. No apology. No eye contact. Just a silent retreat. The system didn't say sorry. It just moved on until someone made it stop. Caleb stood, adjusted his collar, and looked at the wall clock. 3:11 a.m. He was free to go, but he knew it was far from over. Because if they did this to him, someone who knew the law, who was the law, then what were they doing to the people who couldn't fight back? This wasn't about Caleb Mercer anymore. This was about the question, the one they couldn't answer without exposing themselves, the one that cracked the facade. Why? The early morning light had started to leak into the city by the time Caleb Mercer stepped out of the precinct. Charleston was waking up, but Caleb hadn't slept. Not really. His body moved with purpose. But his mind was pacing, retracing every second of the last few hours like a lawyer preparing for war. He had been yanked from his car, cuffed without cause, and dumped into a holding cell. All because he asked for a reason. All because two officers didn't like a black man who didn't flinch when they flexed authority. But now that he was out, there was something far more dangerous in play. He was calm, that still, calculating kind of calm that comes right before someone burns a whole structure down. Not out of revenge, but out of principle. As he slid into his car and closed the door, the weight of the cuffs lingered on his wrists like phantom bruises. He looked at his reflection in the rear-view mirror, not for vanity but clarity. His tie was loose. His eyes were heavy. But there was a fire behind them that hadn't been there the night before. They thought they arrested a threat. What they actually created was a reckoning. He turned the key. The engine purred like nothing had happened, as if it hadn't been used as a stage for humiliation, as if it hadn't been the place where two men played judge and jury on the side of the road. But Caleb remembered everything. The sudden flash of lights, the fake taillight excuse, Greaves's hand pulling the door open, Rose's cuffs clicking shut behind him, and the sound of his own breath, steady, grounded, furious. They hadn't asked for identification beyond his license, hadn't questioned why a man in federal court shoes and a tailored shirt was sitting quietly in a newer model car, because none of that mattered. They didn't see credentials. They saw melanin. And in their world, that was threat enough. As he drove, the city began to unfold around him. People jogging, cafes unlocking their doors, street sweepers brushing away the evidence of the night before. And Caleb? He wasn't going home. He drove straight to the courthouse. He parked in his usual space, walked past the security checkpoint with a nod from the guards who saw him every day, and stepped into the echoing marble lobby. It was almost poetic. Hours earlier, he had been treated like a criminal. Now, he walked into the very institution meant to protect the law, with the power to prosecute those who'd broken it. Only this time, the targets wore blue. He entered his office. Quiet. Controlled. Inside, he placed his keys on the desk, rolled up his sleeves, and opened a clean file folder. He labeled it in bold, capital letters. Mercer v. City of Charleston, Incident Report. This was no longer just a bad night. This was a legal event. He began writing everything, from the moment he saw the lights to the moment he walked out of the precinct. Every word, every gesture, every moment of escalation. The lies, the abuse of power, the silence that followed when he revealed who he was. Then he picked up his phone. He called Simone LeClaire, a civil rights attorney he trusted, not just for her reputation, but for her ferocity in the courtroom. Simone, he said, skipping pleasantries, I need you to represent me. Not because I can't do it myself, but because this case has to be bigger than me. She was silent for a beat. Then, tell me everything. And he did. When he hung up, he felt lighter. Not because justice had been served, but because the process had begun. But there was one more thing. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, silver flash drive. On it was something few people had access to, the department-wide policy database for the Charleston Police Department, which included procedures for traffic stops, use of force, and complaint handling. He had helped review it months ago during a joint oversight committee. Now, he was going to use it to hold the very people who ignored their own policies accountable. That's when his phone buzzed again. An email from an anonymous address. Subject line, they've done it before. Attached were redacted incident reports from other black drivers. People stopped under false pretenses, arrested when they asked questions, then released quietly with no charges and no justice. His blood went cold. This wasn't about Caleb Mercer. This was a pattern. And this time, the pattern picked the wrong target. He stood at his office window, looking out at the Charleston skyline. The courthouse clock struck 8 a.m. Somewhere out there, officers Greaves and Rowe were probably starting their shift, smiling confident, unshaken. But they didn't know what was coming. They thought they could erase a man with metal and lies. But instead, they gave him a story. And Caleb Mercer knew exactly what to do with stories like this. Charleston County Courthouse stood like a fortress, proud, imposing, and soaked in history. History that wasn't always just. History that never really forgot who held power and who was expected to obey it. Caleb Mercer stood just inside its marble entrance, dressed in a charcoal suit, his federal badge tucked away, invisible for now. He was no longer walking in as an assistant U.S. attorney. Today, he was a defendant, and everyone in the building knew it. As he entered the courtroom, heads turned, not out of respect, but curiosity. Whispers followed him like shadows. Isn't that the federal guy? I heard he got arrested last week. For what? They say he resisted. They always say that. Caleb walked past the gallery without flinching, without acknowledging the looks. He kept his focus on the front of the room where the judge's bench loomed high above the floor, as if justice needed to be elevated from the people it was supposed to serve. He took his seat at the defense table. His public defender, Ethan Dyer, sat beside him. Young, smart, clearly out of his depth, the kind of attorney overloaded with court-appointed cases, doing his best with scraps. I read everything twice, Ethan whispered, flipping through a folder. They're leaning hard on the officer's testimony. No body cam? Caleb asked, though he already knew the answer. Ethan shook his head. Malfunctioning, according to the report. Of course. How convenient. The courtroom doors creaked open. Prosecutor Julian Carr walked in like he owned the place. Tall, pressed, perfectly timed. He had the smug confidence of a man used to winning, especially when the defendant was a black man without leverage. Carr nodded to the judge and took his seat at the opposite table. No eye contact with Caleb. Just business as usual. At 10:01 a.m., the bailiff called the courtroom to order. All rise to the Honorable Judge Eleanor Whitaker. She entered with the kind of authority that wasn't questioned, just accepted. White hair in a tight bun. Robes pristine. No nonsense in her step. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She barely looked at Caleb. She didn't have to. Judge Whitaker had a reputation. Stern, impatient, firm on procedure, soft on police error. Caleb had appeared in her court before as a prosecutor. She had always treated him with professional distance. But now, he was on the other side of the table. And that changed everything. Carr stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, this case is straightforward. A routine traffic stop escalated when the defendant became combative and refused to follow lawful orders. Officers acted in accordance with protocol to ensure their safety and the safety of others. Caleb stared at him, expression unreadable. There it was, the opening move, the rewrite, the lie. Judge Whitaker nodded. Proceed. Ethan rose, nervous but composed. Your Honor, the defense will demonstrate that Mr. Mercer was neither combative nor unlawful. There is no footage, no witnesses, only the testimony of two officers who initiated a stop without cause, then escalated the situation beyond reason. Whitaker didn't respond. Her eyes barely flicked toward Caleb. Carr called his first witness, Officer Landon Greaves. Greaves walked to the stand with the posture of a man who had told this story before, many times. His uniform crisp, his tone flat, his eyes confident. The defendant refused to comply, he said. He became verbally aggressive. When asked to exit the vehicle, he questioned our orders repeatedly, raised his voice, and displayed signs of resistance. No detail, no nuance, just broad strokes, designed for headlines. Ethan stood. Officer Greaves, was the defendant armed? No. Did he physically threaten you? He tensed up. Tensed up? Greaves shifted slightly. Yes. His posture became hostile. Ethan frowned. Hostile or firm? Carr objected. Sustained. Whitaker said quickly, move on. Next came Officer Tyler Rowe. Same pattern. Same script. Same vague language dressed up as danger. He made us feel unsafe, Rowe said. We followed procedure. Caleb clenched his jaw. He had prosecuted officers for exactly this, turning discomfort into justification, using feeling unsafe as a catch-all for escalation. Now, the system was using it against him. By the time Rowe stepped down, the damage was clear. The courtroom wasn't about truth. It was about narrative control. And the prosecution was winning. Ethan turned to Caleb. I need to put you on the stand. Caleb nodded. He rose. As he walked past the gallery to the witness chair, a quiet tension settled over the room. Everyone had heard the officer's side. Now, they were going to hear his. But what they didn't know was Caleb Mercer wasn't just going to testify. He was going to expose. Caleb Mercer took the stand not as a defendant, but as a man who had finally decided to speak for every other black man who never got the chance. He sat tall, composed, but inside, a storm was ready. The court clerk asked him to raise his right hand. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Caleb looked straight at her. "I do." Then his eyes turned to the gallery, and finally to Judge Whitaker, who, for the first time since the hearing began, actually looked at him. Not fully, but long enough to know she understood this wasn't just any defendant sitting in front of her. This was the kind of man who knew the walls around him better than the guards patrolling them. Prosecutor Julian Carr stood and walked toward the witness stand. "Mr. Mercer," he began smoothly, "would you say you complied with the officer's instructions the night of your arrest?" Caleb didn't flinch. "I complied with the law." Carr raised an eyebrow. "But you didn't get out of the car when asked." "I requested a reason, which I'm legally allowed to do." Carr paced, slow and deliberate. "So you refused multiple times." "I asserted my rights." "There's a difference." Carr turned to the jury, pretending to shrug as if Caleb was being evasive. He turned back. "Were you aware that the officers feared for safety?" "I was aware that they made no such indication at the time," Caleb answered, voice steady. "There were no commands issued with urgency, no weapons drawn, no threats communicated, just silence and force." Carr's tone tightened. "Isn't it true that your body language could be interpreted as threatening?" Caleb leaned in. "What about my body language was threatening? The fact that I didn't panic? The fact that I asked questions? Or the fact that I'm a black man sitting in a car at midnight?" Silence. A crack formed in Carr's confidence. He cleared his throat. "Let's move on." He opened a folder and held up a police report. "This document, signed by both officers, outlines that you raised your voice, resisted their attempts to remove you, and refused multiple lawful commands. Are they lying?" Caleb didn't even blink. "Yes." That one word hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Carr chuckled lightly, masking tension. "You're saying two decorated officers perjured themselves under oath just to incriminate you? I'm saying their account doesn't match reality. And there's no video to support their version. How convenient." "Objection!" Carr snapped. "Sustained," Judge Whitaker said, but her voice was quieter now. Caleb looked at her for a moment. He could see it. The shift. Small, almost invisible, but it was there. Doubt. Carr returned to his table, visibly frustrated. Ethan Dyer, Caleb's public defender, stood. He didn't pace. He didn't perform. He just looked at his client, trying not to let nerves shake his voice. "Mr. Mercer, did you ever physically resist the officers?" "No." "Did you raise your voice?" "No." "Did you make any threats, implied or explicit?" "None." "Then what happened?" Caleb exhaled, slowly. The courtroom leaned in. "I asked why I was being ordered out of my car. I did not shout. I did not argue. I did not reach for anything. I sat there and waited for a lawful reason. And instead, I was yanked from my seat, cuffed without cause, and labeled a threat because I didn't bow my head." The jury was quiet now, watching, listening. Dyer nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." Then he turned to Judge Whitaker. "Your Honor, the defense rests for now." Whitaker looked like she wanted to move on quickly, but Caleb wasn't done. He raised a hand gently. "Before we end," he said, "I'd like to say one more thing, for the record." Carr started to protest, but Whitaker hesitated. "Proceed," she said. Caleb reached under the bench, into his briefcase. Every eye followed his movement. He pulled out a small leather wallet, flipped it open, and held up his identification for all to see. "I'm Caleb Mercer," he said clearly, "Assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District." Silence. Complete. Total. Shattering. Whitaker's gavel hovered midair, but didn't drop. Carr stood frozen. The officers, seated in the gallery, shifted in their seats. One clenched his jaw. The other tapped his knee. "I wasn't just another arrest," Caleb continued. "I was one of you, and had I not said a word, Had I played along, they would have buried me under false charges without ever knowing who I was. He looked at the jury. And if they did it to me, imagine who else they've done it to. The truth had just walked into the room, and no one could unhear it. For a moment, the courtroom forgot how to breathe. The words still lingered in the air, suspended like smoke. I'm Caleb Mercer, Assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District. A ripple went through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable. The stenographer's hands paused mid-keystroke. The jury shifted, glancing from one another to man they thought they knew. Even the bailiff blinked twice, suddenly unsure of his posture. Across the room, Prosecutor Julian Carr looked like someone had pulled the rug out from under his carefully constructed narrative. His jaw tightened, and he clutched the edge of his folder as if holding onto it might keep his argument from crumbling. Behind him, Officers Greaves and Rowe sat stiffly, no longer smug. Their poker faces fractured. Greaves clenched his fists. Rowe's eyes darted toward the door, as if hoping this part of the trial was over. But it wasn't. It was just beginning. Judge Whitaker cleared her throat, lips pressed into a thin, uncertain line. Mr. Mercer, she said slowly, why didn't you disclose your position earlier? Caleb didn't flinch. Because I shouldn't have to. That answer was more than words. It was an indictment of the system itself, of a culture that demanded man carry a badge to be treated with basic decency. He looked directly at her. If I was an assistant U.S. attorney, if I were just another black man driving home that night, how would this case have gone? Whitaker didn't answer. She couldn't, because they both knew the answer. Ethan Dyer, Caleb's public defender, sat beside him now in stunned silence. He looked like he was still processing what just happened, realizing that his client wasn't just innocent, he was powerful. But it wasn't power that had gotten Caleb cuffed on the side of the road. It was skin. And that's what made this moment so explosive. Julian Carr stood, his voice thin but trying to recover ground. Your Honor, I wasn't informed of this information before today. Had we known, we might have taken a different approach to this matter. Caleb turned toward him, voice calm but sharpened like a blade. Exactly. You would have treated me differently. And that's the problem. He faced the jury again. I wasn't pulled over because I broke the law. I was pulled over because I fit a script, a stereotype officers like Greaves and Rowe have written 100 times. He continued, measured, unwavering. They didn't ask about my job, my background. They didn't care. To them, I was just a black man behind the wheel of the car at midnight. And that was enough. Carr tried to interrupt. Your Honor. But Whitaker raised her hand. For the first time all trial, she didn't shut Caleb down. She didn't tell him to be quiet. She just listened. Caleb exhaled, his voice softening but still filled with fire. If I hadn't said anything today, this courtroom would have convicted me, based on nothing but fabricated reports and broken procedures. No footage, no evidence, just their word against mine. He paused. And the only reason mine matters right now is because I carry a badge. You could feel it, like a shift in atmospheric pressure. The jury, the spectators, the officers, all sat in the weight of those words. A single truth hanging in the air. Justice, too often, comes down to who is speaking, not what they're saying. Caleb sat back. And for once, no one rushed to fill the silence. Judge Whitaker leaned back in her chair. Her fingers tapped the edge of her desk, once, twice, before she finally spoke. Mr. Carr, she said, her voice quieter, less rigid. Do the prosecution have any additional witnesses? Carr hesitated. For too long. No, Your Honor, he said finally, his voice deflated. Whitaker turned to the defense table. Mr. Dyer? Ethan Dyer cleared his throat, still visibly thrown, but doing his best to hold composure. No further witnesses, Your Honor. Whitaker nodded. We'll resume tomorrow for closing arguments. The gavel came down, but it wasn't decisive. It was hesitant, like the system didn't quite know what to do with the truth it had just swallowed. As the courtroom emptied, Caleb didn't move right away. He sat still, watching the officers file out first. They avoided his gaze now, because there was nothing left to say. He had said enough of them all. Ethan leaned toward him, voice low. You knew exactly when to say it. Caleb gave a small smile. No, he replied. I knew exactly when they needed to hear it. Because this wasn't about surprise. This was about exposure. And the cracks in the courtroom were no longer hidden. By the time the courtroom emptied out, something irreversible had happened. Not legally, not officially, but spiritually. A crack had formed in the armor of the justice system, and everyone in that room had heard it echo. Caleb Mercer stood alone at the defense table. His badge, still resting on the surface in front of him, looked out of place in a room where truth had been bent for hours. The small rectangle of metal and leather wasn't just an ID anymore. It was a match, and Caleb had just struck it. In the corner of the room, Prosecutor Julian Carr shuffled his notes with hands that no longer moved with confidence. He didn't look up, not once, because he didn't want to see the man he had just tried to bury, now holding the shovel. Judge Eleanor Whitaker remained seated, unusually still. She wasn't writing, wasn't ruling. She was thinking, and for someone like her, that was more dangerous than anger. Caleb knew what was happening. He'd seen it before, from the other side of the bench. This was the moment where the machine faltered, where routine was disrupted, where the courtroom, usually an engine of predictability, suddenly had to contend with truth, and truth didn't follow protocol. He stepped outside the courtroom into the long hallway lined with portraits of white men in robes, frozen in paint, staring down from above. Generations of justice, framed in silence. Caleb had walked these halls hundreds of times. But today, each footstep sounded different, louder, heavier, because he wasn't just walking as a lawyer now. He was walking as proof. A young intern from the DA's office stood frozen by the water fountain as Caleb passed. She lowered her eyes but couldn't stop staring, not out of fear, but realization. People were starting to whisper, starting to ask questions, the kind that couldn't be filed away. Back in his office, Caleb dropped the badge back into his briefcase and sat down. He was exhausted, but alive. There was no adrenaline, no thrill, just a slow burning heat inside his chest, like a furnace he had kept sealed for far too long. He looked out the window. Downtown Charleston moved on as if nothing had happened. Traffic flowed. People walked. Lives continued. But something had changed. Something had cracked through the concrete. His phone buzzed. A text from Simone LeClaire, the civil rights attorney he had called days earlier. I watched from the gallery. They're rattled. Time to go bigger. He typed back. Agreed. Let's make this public. Because this wasn't about clearing his name anymore. This was about clearing the path. 2 hours later, a short clip from the trial hit social media. Someone in the gallery had filmed it. Shaky, grainy, imperfect. But the audio was crisp. It captured the moment Caleb said it. I'm Caleb Mercer, Assistant United States Attorney. Then silence. Then, if I didn't say that today, you would have convicted me, based on lies. The only reason I matter now is because I carry a badge. The video exploded. In one night, it passed 1 million views. By the next morning, it was on every major news network. Black federal prosecutor reveals identity in court, exposes local police corruption. Charleston judge under fire for ignoring due process. When knowing the law isn't enough, the Caleb Mercer case. And then came the messages from other black men, from public defenders, from families, from people who had been stopped, searched, silenced, and never believed. Some said, thank you. Others said, you're lucky you had a badge. The hardest one said, I didn't. At the precinct, Greaves and Rowe were still working. Barely. Word had reached them. Their sergeant had called them in, stone-faced and silent. Internal Affairs had opened a preliminary review. Whispers were spreading fast. They weren't suspended. Not yet, but they were no longer untouchable. The shield wasn't working like it used to, because now it was being held up to the light. At the courthouse, Judge Whitaker received an anonymous envelope. Inside, a transcript of a 2019 case she presided over. Another false arrest. Another young man with no badge. No defense. The charges had stuck. The man had spent 18 months in county. Attached was a note. You didn't listen to him. You better listen to this one. Caleb sat in his office, the city buzzing around him, his phone lit with headlines, calls, emails, threats, praise. But none of it distracted him from what he knew deep down. This case was never just about him. It was about how close the system had come to swallowing even him whole, despite everything he carried, his education, his record, his badge, because in the end, none of those things were armor. Only exposure was. And he had just set the courtroom on fire. The morning after the video went viral, Charleston wasn't quiet anymore. The courthouse wasn't just a place of order. It was now a battleground of perception. Protesters gathered outside with signs that read, "Justice for the silenced. We stand with Caleb." How many more? Reporters swarmed the front steps. Cameras clicked like firecrackers. Microphones were shoved into faces that had never spoken up before. Every employee who walked through the courthouse entrance passed through a wall of questions they had no answers for. Inside, the energy was different. Clerks typed slower. Officers didn't joke, as they usually did. Judges walked with tighter jaws, because they all knew the machine had been exposed, and one of their own had pulled back the curtain. In her chambers, Judge Eleanor Whitaker sat alone. She hadn't slept, not since the trial paused. The video had reached her desk before sunrise, forwarded by colleagues, law school peers, even her sister who lived 3 states away. She had watched it 3 times. Each time, her expression didn't change. But inside, she felt something heavy and unfamiliar. Doubt. It wasn't just what Caleb Mercer said. It was how he said it. Measured, calm, precise, and devastatingly true. She had ruled over hundreds of cases. Thought she had seen every version of justice the court could offer. But none of them had ever involved a black man standing calmly in her courtroom and daring to ask, "Would you have convicted me if I hadn't told you who I was?" Now, reporters were asking that same question, only louder. Civil rights groups had begun requesting her old transcripts. A team of independent attorneys filed a FOIA request to examine her rulings in past misconduct cases involving police. Whitaker stared at her reflection in the window. She wasn't the impartial figure she imagined herself to be. Not anymore. The robe didn't protect her. The gavel no longer felt like authority. It felt like a weight, and Caleb Mercer had placed it there. Meanwhile, inside the prosecutor's office, Julian Carr wasn't faring much better. The once confident DA now sat behind closed doors, facing 3 senior staff members and a red-faced district chief. "You didn't vet the defendant?" The chief snapped. He presented as a public defendant's client. There was no mention. "Did it occur to you to ask?" Carr swallowed. His hands shook under the table. "I didn't think it mattered." "Well, now it does," the chief growled. "He's not just an AUSA. He's the face of a national scandal. And your name is all over it." Carr tried to defend himself, citing Greaves and Rowe's sworn statements, the absence of body cam footage, standard procedure. But none of it stuck, because now everyone was looking at the outcome, not the excuses. His career wasn't over. Not yet, but the cracks had formed. And Carr, once invincible in the courtroom, now looked like a man waiting to be replaced. At the Charleston Police Department, the fallout was even worse. Officers Landon Greaves and Tyler Rowe were officially placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation that had gone from routine to emergency status in less than 12 hours. Their locker room had gone silent. Colleagues they had joked with 2 days ago now avoided eye contact. Nobody wanted to be caught standing too close. The department's Internal Affairs Division launched a review not only of the Mercer stop, but 11 other stops made by the same unit in the last 3 years. And then came the first crack in their story. A dispatch supervisor discovered a hole in the call logs from the night of Caleb's arrest. No radio call was ever logged regarding a broken taillight. No probable cause. No legal justification for the stop. When asked to explain it, Greaves claimed the radio was malfunctioning. Rowe said he thought Greaves had called it in. Neither could produce documentation. The story was unraveling. And this time, it wasn't just a man's freedom on trial. It was the system's memory. Back in his apartment, Caleb watched all of it unfold. The press conferences, the leaked documents, the online debate, the hashtags. He should have felt vindicated, empowered, but all he felt was clarity. This wasn't a victory. It was confirmation. Confirmation that even he, a federal prosecutor, a man who helped write indictments, could have been swallowed by the same broken system he once served. All it took was two men with badges, a lie, and a judge too disinterested to ask more. And he knew what that meant. There were others, people who never made it out, people who had no badge to reveal, people whose names weren't trending because they were buried in sealed files and dismissed motions. He picked up his phone, dialed Simone again. "We're not just defending this case anymore," he told her. "We're starting a review panel. We're pulling records. We're finding the ones who never got their day in court." Simone's voice was calm, firm. "Good, because now people are watching. And this time, they're not looking away." The video didn't just go viral, it detonated. By noon, it had been reshared over 4 million times. By evening, it was being discussed on every major cable news network. By the next morning, it was everywhere. Black federal prosecutor exposes corrupt cops in open court. Charleston judge faces backlash after shocking courtroom twist. Would you have convicted me if I wasn't a prosecutor? A question America can't ignore. It wasn't just content. It was a mirror. And America was finally looking at itself, whether it liked the reflection or not. Caleb Mercer watched the storm unfold from his apartment, lit only by the glow of his laptop screen. He'd barely slept, not from fear or anxiety, but from a kind of alertness that buzzed in his bloodstream. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't laying low. He was watching, studying the digital domino effect of truth in motion. One clip had sparked a fire, but it wasn't just a video. It was a conversation. Thousands of people, black, brown, white, young, old, were posting their own stories. "My brother went through this in 2016. He didn't have a badge. This happened to me 2 blocks from where this guy was arrested. This is why we don't trust the system. Because we are the system, and it still treats us like we're disposable." People weren't just reacting. They were connecting. A young journalist named Ava Langston, working for the Charleston Chronicle, had been sitting in the gallery that day, typing furiously. She'd gone to court expecting a routine hearing. Instead, she witnessed a man burn down an entire courtroom with 6 words. "I'm an assistant United States attorney." Her piece went live 24 hours later and hit like an aftershock. This case wasn't built to survive the truth. The article laid everything bare: Greaves and Rowe's statements, the missing call logs, Judge Whitaker's dismissal of objections, Carr's polished collapse, and most importantly, Caleb's silent resilience in the face of injustice. It was journalism with teeth. By the time national outlets started quoting Ava's article, her inbox had filled with emails. Former defendants, lawyers, even retired judges. Each one told her the same thing. This isn't new. It's just new that someone like him survived it. At City Hall, Mayor Evelyn Shaw held an emergency press conference. Her tone was careful, too careful. She spoke of transparency, respect for legal proceedings, and trust in internal processes. But no one was buying it, because the internet doesn't forget. And neither did the people. By the time the press conference ended, a group of civil rights attorneys had already filed a federal complaint demanding a DOJ review of Charleston PD's stop-and-search records from the last 10 years. Caleb's story wasn't just a headline anymore. It was evidence. Inside the police department, Greaves and Rowe were no longer in uniform, suspended, without pay. The Internal Affairs Office had combed to their past reports and found disturbing patterns. Identical phrasing, inconsistent justifications, missing timestamps, and one glaring trend. Over 90% of their resistance arrests involved black or Latino drivers. An anonymous whistleblower from inside the department leaked emails. Greaves and Rowe had been caught joking about putting people in their place. One email even said, "Gotta remind some folks that a badge outranks a degree." That one email hit harder than a punch, because it confirmed what so many had felt for so long. This wasn't about law. It was about control. Judge Whitaker, once untouchable, now found herself under a microscope. Civil rights organizations began reviewing every ruling she had made over the last decade involving police testimony and black defendants. The results were grim. A 92% conviction rate, where body cam footage was missing and police were the sole witnesses. People started asking, was she biased or just blind? Either way, it didn't matter, because the public wasn't quiet anymore. Meanwhile, Caleb wasn't celebrating. He wasn't taking interviews, wasn't giving speeches. He was meeting with lawyers, journalists, victims. He had turned his office into a war room. Photos, case files, internal records, witnesses coming forward. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was building something bigger. A coalition, a task force, a reckoning. Late one night, Simone called him. Her voice was tired but solid. "You just opened the door, Caleb." "I didn't open it," he said quietly. "I just showed people it was never locked to begin with." She was silent for a moment, then asked, "Do you regret saying it in court? Dropping the badge like that?" Caleb looked out his window. The city lights flickered like stars, unaware they were being watched. "No," he said, "because now they can't pretend they didn't see it. The internet forgets birthdays, anniversaries, trends, but injustice, it remembers. And now, so did everyone else. At first, it was just a few posters, taped to lampposts near the courthouse, hung from balconies in East Charleston, printed by college students on home printers. A silhouette of Caleb Mercer's face, staring forward, bold, unblinking. Beneath it, just 5 words. "Would you have convicted me?" Then came the murals. Then came the crowds. Then came the movement. By the end of the week, the story had left Charleston. It was in Atlanta, Chicago, New York, Oakland, on protest signs, hashtags, podcasts. People weren't just talking about Caleb anymore. They were organizing. Rallies swept across city halls with chants of, "We are Caleb. No badge, no justice. Protect the voiceless." What began as a courtroom moment became a national wake-up call. Not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. Caleb wasn't a martyr. He wasn't a celebrity. He was something more dangerous to the system. He was proof that the system would chew up anyone, even one of its own. And now, people were asking, if that's how they treat a federal prosecutor, what happens to the rest of us? Inside Caleb's office, things moved fast. His small team, once just him and Simone, had grown. Law students, civil rights lawyers, data analysts, ex-police whistleblowers. They turned his case into a database, his testimony into a toolkit, his badge into a beacon. They called it the Mercer Files, a growing archive of stories like his: misconduct, wrongful arrests, patterns in police language, judicial leanings, gaps in footage, repeat offenders in uniform. It wasn't just activism. It was strategy. The Charleston Police Department was drowning. An external review found that over 68 complaints of misconduct had been internally dismissed in the last 5 years, many tied to the same division grieves and role worked in. The city scrambled. They offered a public apology, a task force, a promise. But the protests didn't stop, because people had heard apologies before. What they hadn't seen was accountability. Judge Eleanor Whitaker, once confident, now cornered, faced mounting pressure. Activists pulled up 5 past cases where she had ruled against defendants later proven innocent. Articles surfaced questioning her judicial history, her silence in court when Caleb objected to false statements, her quick overruling of every defense motion. She released a written statement, not an apology, but a justification. Judicial restraint should not be mistaken for indifference. But restraint, the people said, looked a lot like complicity. Petitions circled calling for her resignation, not because of rage, but because of receipts. Meanwhile, Greaves and Rowe were under federal investigation. Their lawyers tried to paint them as misunderstood and pressured. But leaked audio recordings surfaced, casual locker room conversations, laughter about checking mouthy drivers, references to quotas. The recordings didn't just damage their case. They demolished it. What was once hearsay had become evidence. And the 2 men who once believed the badge made them gods now waited for judgment in silence. But Caleb? He remained quiet through it all. Not because he was afraid, but because he was listening. He sat across from victims, from men who had been beaten, from women who had been pulled over and humiliated, from parents who buried sons over a traffic stop. He didn't speak first. He let them, because for years, no one had. And in those rooms, quiet, honest, raw, he saw the truth. This was never about his badge. It was about their stories. His job wasn't to speak for them. It was to make sure they'd never be ignored again. One night, he stood in front of a crowd at a rally. No podium, no lights, no fanfare. Just him and them. He held up his old badge, not as a shield, but as a symbol. Then he dropped it into a glass box and said, "This gave me a voice, but it shouldn't take this. For you to be heard too." That moment was live streamed. It spread faster than the video in the courtroom. And this time, the headline wasn't about him being a prosecutor. It was about a black man turning power back toward the people. The movement had a name now, not just one, because this wasn't about one case, one officer, one judge, one man. It was about all the ones who came before and all the ones who couldn't speak. The courtroom was silent, but not the kind of silence that came from routine. This wasn't the hush before verdict. This was the stillness of reckoning. Every seat was filled. Reporters lined the back wall, pens in hand but not moving. Phones were out, cameras already rolling. The world was watching now, not because of celebrity, but because truth had finally refused to whisper. Caleb Mercer sat at the defense table, posture upright, eyes calm. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't afraid. He was simply ready. Across from him, Prosecutor Julian Carr looked like a man who knew his playbook had run out of pages. No swagger, just sweat. Behind Carr, the two men who had started all of this, Officers Greaves and Rowe, sat still, pale, and stripped of uniform. They were no longer the enforcers. They were witnesses to their own undoing. Judge Eleanor Whitaker entered from chambers slower than usual. Her robe hung heavier than it did 2 weeks ago. The gavel sat in front of her like a question. She took her seat, cleared her throat. The bailiff stood. Court is now in session. Every person leaned forward a little more. Whitaker looked down at her notes, though she didn't need them. The facts were burned into every corner of the room. She began slowly. After reviewing all testimony, evidence, and the broader context surrounding this case, this court recognizes that what occurred the night of Mr. Mercer's arrest was not only a legal failure, but a moral one. The courtroom didn't move. Even air seemed reluctant to exhale. She looked directly at Caleb now. "Mr. Mercer, the court finds you not guilty on all charges." Gasps. Applause. Cameras clicking in rapid fire. But Caleb? He didn't move. He just breathed. Because this wasn't vindication. This was necessary. Whitaker wasn't done. She turned to the prosecution. "Furthermore, this court will be forwarding all transcripts, testimony, and dispatch law discrepancies to the State Attorney General's office for full review and potential criminal charges against Officers Greaves and Rowe." This time, the room did move. Reporters shot to their feet. Carr blinked like he had just stepped off a cliff. Greaves lowered his head. Rowe clenched his jaw. It was the kind of moment police never expected to face in a courtroom. Accountability. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted. Cheers, tears, chants. Justice didn't whisper today. Caleb Mercer walked, so others could rise. He stepped into the noise, greeted not by fame, but by recognition. Not as a hero, but as a symbol. A black man who knew too much, who refused to shrink, who forced the system to look back at itself. But he didn't raise his fist. He didn't deliver a monologue. He just stood there, letting the world see him fully. No robe, no badge, no chains, just truth. In the days that followed, the fallout spread like wildfire. The state AG launched an independent task force to investigate Charleston PD's history of misconduct. Whitaker requested to be reassigned to civil cases, an unofficial step down. Julian Carr announced he would not seek re-election. Greaves and Rowe were both indicted for falsifying reports, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. But most importantly, dozens of past defendants, people who had once been labeled aggressive, non-compliant, unworthy, were now being reheard. And Caleb was there for all of it, not just as a lawyer, not just as a witness, but as a living reminder that the system doesn't get to forget what it tried to bury. In one final press conference, he said, "This case was never about me. It was about who the system thinks you are when it thinks no one's watching. I had a badge. I had power. But most people don't. And it's for them that I'll keep showing up." And he meant it, because justice, he had learned, isn't about loud victories. It's about quiet resistance. It's about every black man who ever asked, "Why am I being stopped?" and never got an answer. Only cuffs. It's about turning a courtroom into a battlefield and leaving the door open for the next one to walk through. And so, Caleb Mercer walked out of the courthouse that final day, not as the man they arrested, but as a man who refused to disappear. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Like, comment, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the more people who see what really happens, the harder it becomes for injustice to hide. This isn't just content. It's a call. And your voice, your share, might be the one that sparks change. Tap subscribe. Share the truth. Keep the pressure on.